Hi, this is Lee Carter, and I'm here with the other editors of A Shared Inheritance. And this month, the month of July, our topic has been the helmet of salvation. And so we've been talking about the pieces of the armor separately each month. And one of the common themes of our conversations actually has been that by looking at each piece independently, we really see how interdependent they are. It makes perfect sense, and it becomes more and more clear how thoroughly God has equipped us to his work. He's thought of everything that we need to fight, to hope, and to have confidence in him and in his promises. And it is, after all, his armor. We see him use it in Isaiah, the 59th chapter, when there's no intercessor in Israel. And so his own arm brings salvation for him, and God wears the breastplate of righteousness and has the helmet of salvation on his head, and he comes to destroy his enemies, to protect his people, and to glorify his name. So it is God's armor in the sense that it belongs to him, and he allows us to wear it and to wield it to fight for his kingdom and his cause. If we begin with the truth as our girdle, that's what's wrapped around us, keeping the armor snugly fit, and we have the righteousness of God guarding and protecting our hearts, we're grounded, firmly standing on the gospel of peace, and God places that helmet of salvation on our heads when we're baptized into his service and we become his soldiers. Any piece out of place causes a weakness in the armor. If the truth isn't what we have wrapped around us, if it's not God's truth, and if his righteousness is not our standard, if that's not what we're looking for to guide our lives, looking toward, if we're not standing firm in his gospel and of peace and our reconciliation with him, then God's helmet of salvation is not what we have on our heads. Understanding that God has offered us his helmet of salvation should push us into the battle. And that takes us out of our comfort zone, which Jennifer, one of our authors this month, talked about in her article. We have to make certain that we don't lose what it is that God has so graciously offered to us. We want to be identified as his soldiers. The Roman helmets, which is one of the things that Paul certainly has on his mind, I would think, as he's writing this, they were conspicuous. They were meant to be seen. In fact, they were meant to intimidate, to make a Roman soldier look taller and bigger than he might actually be. And not like an easy target, like someone of substance, someone who was going to be a foe in a fight. And so others should be able to see that. It should make us easily identifiable if we have the helmet of salvation on our heads. And we should stand out from the rest of the world. Not only does it identify us, but it protects us from deadly head injuries. I was having a conversation with my daughter-in-law, Shelby, who was one of our other authors this month, about the helmet of salvation. And she was talking about the fact that it's not a mistake that salvation sits on our heads, that it makes sense, that it protects that our thoughts and our minds, and that it's a result of a logical decision that we have made. It's not an emotional decision. There is certainly emotion with it, but it is a logical thought process that brings us to Christ. It's not without reason. And so when we put on Christ in salvation and baptism, we do that, and God gives us his armor, his righteousness, his peace, his truth, and he offers us salvation. In Titus 2, Paul writes to Titus that the grace of God has appeared that offers salvation to all people. It teaches us to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in this present age. Not only is salvation offered by the grace of God to all people through the coming of Christ in the flesh and the redemption that he offered with his sacrifice of love, the sacrifice that would reconcile man to God, it is an offer of salvation. It requires acceptance. It is the only salvation to be had. We know that in Acts 4, told that salvation is found nowhere else. There is no other name under heaven given to mankind by which we must be saved. But if we accept it, if we allow it to work in us, if we understand the love and mercy that are extended, then it can teach us to say no. No to ungodliness and the desires of our flesh, no to being out of control with our pride or our behavior, and no to living without integrity. And it does that for people in every age, Titus's age and our age. As loving and faithful disciples, we have to put everything of this earth and our flesh aside and wholeheartedly pursue the things of the heavenly kingdom, living every moment, understanding that we are in the presence of the Almighty and that his armor is the only thing that can give us hope to surviving the battle. Certainly a soldier or a firefighter or any kind of emergency worker or even a football player would not go onto the field without their helmet on. That would be crazy. And yet we know that many people enter the fray of life with no hope of eternal life, no helmet on their head. It protects us from deadly head wounds. Head wounds are almost always deadly. And so if our minds are not protected by the salvation of God, then our thoughts and ideas are just based on whatever modern culture is putting out there. And it's a constantly moving target, believing one thing one day and another thing the next. The truth is never constant. It shifts, and there's no hope in that world. And so, Jill, we're going to come to you first, because that's the piece of the conversation that you've been thinking about. We've said that the helmet of salvation is protecting our thoughts so that we can understand what's good and true, so that we can understand righteousness. How do we use the helmet then to protect our heads and our minds from the enemy and the warfare that engages us?
So I was actually doing a little research on this, and it made me laugh. I came across the sign that I feel like we've periodically seen throughout our lives when we're walking under something, when it says "mind your head." And so the more I kept thinking about that, I was like, that's exactly it. Mind your head. That's actually think about what's going into your head and how you're actually thinking. And as Christians, we're told to mind our heads and to not be of this world. I feel like this piece of what you were talking about is the verse I love most on this is Romans 12:2, where it's saying, do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. And I feel like that's how it transforms our mind. It should change the way that we think about things. It kind of, again, gets us out of the weeds and back into that 30,000 foot view that we need to go through this life. We should have that eternal mindset, again, rather than just what it is that we see here on this earth. So how you think in large part determines how you feel and how you act. And I feel like a lot of times we don't really think about that. We think if it's in our head, it's fine. To say, and it's not. And again, excuse me, teachers here, but I couldn't find who said this, but I loved this quote where it said, the ideas and the images in men's minds are the invisible powers that constantly govern them. And so that's why it's so important that we mind our head. It shapes everything we do and everything we feel. And I know a lot of times it feels like we don't have control over what we think, but that's not true. This is actually a conversation I've had a lot lately with some of my friends' teenage daughters and going through like talking about, no, you just because you feel that way right now, like you do have control over what you're thinking. And as I've mentioned before, I deal with anxiety, and probably about 10 years ago was when I had really bad panic attacks. And that was the first thing the doctor would then always ask, what were you thinking about when you noticed that you were having a panic attack? And my immediate reaction, of course, was like, I wasn't thinking about anything. but that's not true. As I started to become more aware of when this would happen, they were right. There was always a line of thinking that would lead up to the panic attack, or at least perpetuate it. So anyways, my point here is that if our thoughts can even produce these physical reactions, such as very real panic attacks, we really need to be, that's how important it is to be mindful of our minds. And we need to take note of what we are thinking and make sure we're allowing our minds to be transformed and renewed, and again, not conform to this world. So I've talked about this before, and we've read this before, but it fits in so well, about how do we do this. So I'm going to read from Philippians again, just because it sums it up perfectly. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. What you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. And again, there it starts with thinking these things, and then you'll practice these things. So anyways, that's my quick 2 cents on.
Right. And the verses just prior to that are where he talks about putting a wall up around your mind, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's where the peace that passes understanding comes from.
Sorry, I felt like I talked about that a long time last. So I felt like I talked about those verses a long time, and I was like, you can't keep saying the same thing. So,
there goes Jillian again. Back and
exactly. I need that wall. That's the problem.
Well, we all do, right? I mean, and I think that's part of that same function.
Yeah. That
it's a military term, again, that idea of building a wall, a military bastion, a fortress around our minds. And I have the conversation a lot with teenagers as well, that it's not that you don't have the thought, it's what you do with it once it's in your brain, how you deal with it. And I tell them, I talk out loud sometimes, and when I'm getting myself in a cycle, I'll say, okay, stop.
Yeah.
Out loud.
Well, and part of it, I think, to start with, is recognizing you're having those thoughts, because that's a lot of times I feel like we're just like, well, that's how I feel. And you're like, no, it is because you're thinking like that. And so if you can stop yourself right when I have those thoughts, anyway, it is a discipline. So
discipline. And that's the whole point, is that we discipline our hearts and our minds.
Yep.
Because
it affects everything else.
We make them in servitude to us rather than us being in servitude.
Exactly.
Those impulses. We bring them under control, right? So that's right. And I think also that whole idea is that then what that does is it identifies us as something else, and we begin to identify ourselves as something else. It really becomes about our own identity, which is another topic that we're going to talk about, Amy, because another function of our helmet is that it identifies us as soldiers of Christ. And one of the things that that soldiers did was they would engrave their crests on their helmets. And so I started thinking, in what ways do we engrave our crest on our helmet? We know that we have to be in the world, but we can't look like the world. And so what does that look like then in our daily lives?
So Jillian saved me some time, because my first verse was Romans 12:2. But I'm sure that's a theme of today. But, I had been going just exactly what you guys were talking about. Lately, I've really been pondering a lot about cultivating our loves. That's something we talk about where my kids go to school. And so really thinking about, how do I cultivate the right loves in my children? And, if we think about physical items, there are certain things you have to cultivate a love for. So honestly, I'm sitting here drinking a cup of black coffee, and I guarantee most people, if they take an initial drink of black coffee, they'd say, why would you ever drink this? It's disgusting. But you cultivate a love for it, right? You build that up over time, maybe even things like strong cheeses, right? We could come up with, and honestly, if you ask my daughter, vegetables are going to be a love that she has to cultivate. I mean, it's just what it is. But I think you can cultivate those, right? Those are things you can build up, and you actually learn to really like them and enjoy them. In the same way, in our spiritual lives or certain things, I think there are items that come naturally to us. So selfishness and self-righteousness and pride, those seem to be things, they're just easy to do, right? I mean, I don't have to think much about it. I can just act that way. But other items like the fruit of the spirit, you have to cultivate. You're going to have to get in there and plow and dig and really work at growing that fruit, because I think the way we show our crest is the fruit of our lives. So I know we said being in the world, but not of the world. I actually think we could look a lot like the world physically, right? I mean, I read that parable of the wheat and tares that Jesus talks about, that, just wait until they're grown, then you'll see the fruit, right? You'll understand what they really are when they're fully matured. And in our lives, I think that's it exactly. So what fruit are we displaying? And I started thinking about the pattern of the armor, actually, just what you were going through, Lee. How does this manifest in our lives with each of these pieces? So I think the very first thing, the belt of truth, we're going to speak the truth. That's who we will be known as, people that speak the truth in love, I would say, but we speak the truth and we seek the truth. I think that's the other thing, right? So in Ephesians 4:25, earlier in Ephesians, I would have to go grab it, but he actually says, speak truthfully to your neighbor, right? That's how we're supposed to speak to each other. And then if you look on the Sermon on the Mount, he says, seek and you shall find. So I think if we're actively seeking the truth, we will find the truth. But we live in a culture that wants their own personal truths, right? Not a solid truth. And I think we have to be known for people that are not saying, I don't find the truth in me, I find the truth in God's word. The second thing I think that is different is when we talked about the breastplate of righteousness, we live differently. We allow ourselves to be clothed in God's righteousness. And I know Randy is probably going to get into this much more, but I thought in 1 Peter 4:1-4, it really described this well, where Peter says, therefore, since Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same understanding, because the one who suffers in the flesh is finished with sin, in order to live the remaining time in the flesh, no longer for human desires, but for God's will. For there has already been enough time spent in doing what the Gentiles choose to do, carrying on an unrestrained behavior, evil desires, drunkenness, orgies, carousings, and lawless idolatry. They are surprised that you don't join in them in the same flood of wild living, and they slander you. So I think Peter really clearly states you're going to live differently, right? And the world's going to be surprised that you don't want to join in with them in the type of living they participate in. And then if we think about the shoes of peace, I think that of the gospel of peace, the gospel is going to provide an internal peace in our lives that will look different to the outside world. And it's going to have us live in peace with others as much as depends on us. So I think that also means that we're going to speak differently, quite frankly. We're going to allow the good news to speak into others in an encouraging, uplifting, and joyful manner, even in the midst of storms raging about us and suffering and whatever else is going on, right? We're going to allow that peace to have us speak and live internally differently. But then the last one and I know we talked about this last month, but faith is really kind of a blend of trust, right? What do we put our faith, our trust in? I think we as people will then put our trust in something totally different than the world. And this reminded me of Isaiah 31 in verse 1. It says, woe to those who go down to Egypt for help and who depend on horses. They trust in the abundance of chariots and in the large number of horsemen. They do not look to the Holy One of Israel. They do not seek the Lord. And then in verse 3, it says, Egyptians are men, not God. Their horses are flesh, not spirit. When the Lord raises his hand to strike, the helper will stumble and the one who is helped will fall. Both will perish together. So if we put our trust in human things, guess what? We're going to fall with them. So, I don't care what country you're living in. That's something human, including America, right? It will, at some point, it will fall just the same as every other country in the past has. Government is not what you should put your trust in. I think we could probably all agree on that. Money is not something you should put your trust in. It's fleeting. We're looking at now times where people are getting super upset because they see their retirement going up in flames or whatever it may be. Well, that's because money isn't what you can put your trust in. We have to really be thoughtful. And I'll be honest, these are things I struggle with, right? I struggle with continually saying, this is what I have to demonstrate to the world, right? If I'm running along beside them just the same as they are, acting in the same ways, thinking in the same ways, then I'm really no different, right? And it's hard. It's cultivating a different love. And if you've worked in a garden, you know cultivation is not necessarily easy, but it's so worth it. The product and the fruit is so worth it. And I think that's how we have to demonstrate to the world that we're wearing the helmet of salvation.
I think that's a great connection, especially the idea that with the fruit of the spirit and things like that, that we're going to look different just automatically because we've been transformed, because our minds are different, what's in our hearts is different. And so everything that our life is about is going to be different. I used to tell John, how will the world know that you're different if you look and sound like the world? If your life is about the same things that everybody else's life is about, then you're not different. You're them. That's what you are. And so I think that's really a great connection. Everybody lives their life as if something is true. And so it goes back to that belt of truth. What's your truth? What are you putting your faith and your trust in? I think that's a good, thank you for those thoughts. Randy, one of the things that we talked about this month too is one of the things that can be misunderstood about salvation is that somehow we earn it, or rather than having it given to us and offered. And hopefully we've been very clear about the fact that salvation is given and not earned. It's not something that we can produce within and of ourselves. But could you discuss for just a moment your understanding of how, even though salvation isn't something that's earned, we do have to ensure that we maintain it. It's not something that once we have it is going to cover us regardless for all time. And so those thoughts about that.
Yeah. Oh, so I think that sometimes, and I've heard it in different congregations, that I think sometimes we think about our helmet as this little thing that sort of sits precariously on our heads. And when we stumble, it just flies right off and we have to go and get it and put it back on. And even though we're trying to walk and do what's right, we all stumble and we all trip up and the salvation just pops off our head and it just falls off and we have to put it back on. And I just, I don't think that has ever been the way that God shows that he rescued his people. So I think that's worth saying, right? Like Noah's Ark wasn't leaky. And when he saved Daniel from the lions, it wasn't like this wishy-washy thing that our salvation is firmly planted on our heads. And we know that it's not glued to our heads either, that we can lose our salvation. We see examples of this in the Old Testament, and we see pretty extensively in the epistles ways to bring people back after they've taken off this helmet. But I do think that it is a decision that we, for whatever reason, have to make. We have to remove it, and it has to be a decision that we've actively made. To take off our armor, which it seems really ridiculous notion that we would take it off, except that, and then we remember who our adversary is, and the devil is so smart, and he's smarter than us. He's not smarter than God though, and God has given us this armor. And so how do we maintain the helmet? Don't be an idiot. Don't take off your helmet. I mean, it sounds so flippant, but don't be stupid. Don't take off your armor. And I say that flippantly because it is the devil, but I think it kind of boils down to, I think the devil uses lies, but he has to get us to take off this armor in order for us to lose our salvation. It has to be something that we are actively deciding to do. And so I just kind of came up with a few things that I feel like the devil lies to us about. And he's brilliant. It would be stupid for us not to realize how smart the devil is to get us to do these things. But I think that the devil can tell us that our armor isn't strong enough. And Amy kind of talked about this, that she read that passage in Isaiah. We see this over and over, that people didn't think that God was enough almost. So they looked to the Egyptians. We see kings of Israel and Judah become vassal states of the Syrians and the Egyptians. And it was that kind of thing. They were worried that God's power and his promises were not strong enough to protect them from other people in the world. When Israel was up against Goliath, until David showed up, they were fearful of the Philistines. And we see that a lot. And I think we face the same things today, that we can be overwhelmed and helpless in certain situations. And we feel like, surely, doing what's right, that maybe what God's told us is the mark of a Christian. Like, how could that possibly help? If we act this way, people are going to take advantage of us. That can't be what God means to be quiet and peaceable. Or it just doesn't always make sense within the world standards to act like a Christian. It's hard to see sometimes how we will be rescued from these hardships if we act the way that we're supposed to. And so I think that's one way that the devil gets us to take off our armor. We think that there's a better way to handle things. I think he tells us sometimes that we don't deserve the armor, or the opposite, that the armor is ours in the first place. Is Ezekiel 16, Israel's compared to a woman who's been taken out. She's all bloody. And this prince comes and he gets her and he cleans her up and he puts all these fancy garments on her and he puts jewels and everything on her. And then she forgets who gave it to her in the first place. And she starts hooking up with other guys. And I mean, that was an analogy that Ezekiel used to show Israel, that God made Israel great. And that then Israel goes and they kind of get too big for their britches and they start worshiping idols, and they think that it's their greatness and they forget that it's God's. And I think that's another way that we could take off our armor. I think that the most common way, though, at least within our society, is that he tells us that we don't need armor, that he says in this world, we don't, why are you, that armor looks really heavy. It seems like it's burdensome, and look, there's no danger. And, when he lies to us about the fact that we are in this active battle and that we are fighting an adversary that is way too smart for us, despite what he says. And so, again, I think, how do we maintain the helmet of salvation? I think, like Jill was talking earlier, we're training our minds. We have to constantly remind ourselves who our commander is and our leader that will not lose. And I think we need to remember who our enemy is. And I think that we do this by reading the Bible. We see these stories where we understand who God is. We understand the promises. It's the reason that we worship with like-minded. And I think it's the reason that we pray. And in the end, don't be an idiot. Don't take off your helmet. So I think it's an active thing.
I do too. And I think it's a really important thing for us to think about, the fact that we don't want to underestimate our enemy.
Mm.
That idea that we kind of, I think you're right, that we think we don't really need the armor. And I know I made a reference in my article this month to having taken off my helmet and left the field. And certainly that was a conscious decision that I made. I think you're right. I don't think it pops off or flies off when we stumble over a rock, or I think it's just like the breastplate of righteousness. I think it's there for those who are trying to commit and trying to do the work and but I do think we can make a conscious decision to say this just isn't worth it. And I think that's, you know, at least in my life, I was at a point where I just thought this is just too hard. I can't. And maybe it was partly also, I'm not worthy of the armor, you know, that idea that I'll never be good enough, which none of us will be. It's just another thing that Satan uses against us, looking at our own inadequacies, which are real. But, you know, focusing on that rather than the power of the armor. And our armor will show those signs. I, you know, if you think about it in a visual, if you try to visualize it, I try to visualize what my armor must look like at this point. Banged up and dented for sure. And Elizabeth, we've talked about that before, the idea that our armor certainly shows the signs of our battle. And in Shelby's article this month, she talked about the fact that a lot of times helmets, particularly, I guess the most American example is football players, I think, have stickers on their helmets for tackles that they've made, and they show achievements. And we know that some Roman helmets had similar things affixed to them. Given our understanding and our conversation, particularly about the righteousness of God, how should our helmets give us confidence that our salvation is secure, that it won't just pop off our heads? Those ideas of achievements and successes and battle scars.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I think this has been a great discussion because you know, as has been amply pointed out, we don't earn salvation. Salvation was a gift. It was a gift that from the beginning, God determined he would offer all of us for anyone who would put it on. And I think of those Old Testament folks who they too looked for that salvation. You know, Simeon is the great example of what those who were expecting the salvation to come and praying for the salvation to come when he finally sees this little 41 at best day old child and says, I have now seen the salvation of the Lord. And so we can't, I think, lose sight of that. And I think for all, as we mature and get older, and certainly I have a lot more of that to do, you know, understanding that helmet is something that fits in order to protect the brain, you know, and most helmets are strapped. I think the Roman helmets were strapped to us, you know, to their heads. And like you said, they were decorated for glory, with glory and for honor. And really the saints of the world are those that are decorated for glory and honor. That's how God sees us. I think it's interesting when people don't want to call themselves saints. That's exactly who wears those helmets of salvation, is those who God looks down upon as his saints. And saints are people who are not caught up in the salvations offered by the world. Because what we need to not lose sight of is that there are many of our friends in the world who believe that the world has things to offer that will save them. And Amy alluded to that, whether it be a political, I mean, it astounds me to watch people think, you know, talk about some worldly man as if they're going to save them. And we can lose sight of what this helmet of salvation wrapped around our head and strapped to our heads represents in our lives. I went to 1 Thessalonians 5 when Paul is writing to these that he loves, and he says, you know, now, brothers and sisters, about the times and the dates, we do not need to write to you, for you know very well that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. He says, you're not going to know when it's going to come. People are going to be saying peace and safety and destruction will come suddenly. And then he continues on and he says, brother and sisters are not in darkness so that the day will surprise them like a thief. I think that understanding that we are the saints, we are the saved, makes us not look to the world for something, but to know that we are constantly looking for that day to come, that our salvation, our helmets will be realized, that is what we wear. That is who we are. It defines us very deeply within. It's what controls our brain. It's what's protecting our brain. He goes on to say, we don't belong to night or to darkness. So then let us not be like the others who are asleep, but let us be awake and sober. And he goes on to say, since we belong to the day, let us be sober, putting on faith and love as a breastplate and the hope of salvation as the helmet. And those are the ones, that is what those who are understand, we have no idea when this world is going to end, but we know God is in control and he is coming. Our Lord is coming. And it makes us then, as everybody here has alluded to today, live differently. Then our lives look different. And I believe our lives and the demonstration of our helmets look different. Our plumage gets bigger. Our lights get stronger. We live with confidence, not afraid. You know, we're not afraid. We're not, you know, we're not afraid. It is a helmet that we wear. And it also tells us later in this same passage to build each other up in this, to encourage each other, remind each other, you do know you're saved, right? You do know you're wearing the helmet of salvation on your head. You haven't got a lot to worry about. You haven't got a lot to fear. You got it on your head, man. And so putting on this salvation, which by the way, God authored and God provided and God designed, this salvation that comes through Christ, like I said, as Simeon held this little baby and said, I've now seen the salvation of the Lord. I'm off my watch. I can leave my watch. I'm done. I've seen it with my eyes. And so we know that through faithful obedience to him, it is then what we put on when we are baptized into the body of Christ. I believe that is a very textual, scriptural concept, that we then become those who are saints, who are saved, who wear that helmet of salvation. And our hopes, then, our hope that was talked about in 1 Thessalonians 5, as we look to him to come, is not this cross fingers. Oh, I hope that when he comes, I'm there, you know, that through grace and mercy, that's the other thing, is not provided on the day of judgment, has been provided. It was grace and mercy which provided us the helmet of salvation, that we're not walking around like this all the time, but in communion with God. It is that confident hope that our God keeps his promises, and that all who obey, trust, and live with Christ, in Christ, that is, that it is not I who liveth, but Christ liveth in me, will then demonstrate in life as they walk in the light that God has promised, and we believe, and we are excited, and we are sure. I'll tell you how to convert somebody. You convert somebody because you're excited that you're wearing the helmet of salvation and you want them to wear one too, because that's what we believe. And we lose sight of that, and we don't keep that excitement and that zeal, because we forget what we have upon our heads protecting our brains. And it's extended to everybody. Salvation had not been realized by any. You think about that. Abraham had not realized it, not Moses and Elijah. I think that transfiguration, that beautiful scene just months before Jesus forces himself in the flesh to go into Jerusalem in order that he might bring salvation. You know who needed him to do that? Moses and Elijah. They needed him to do it because it was through him that salvation come. Everybody needed his blood. We just forget. We forget what not even the angels knew until Jesus came in the flesh and through his blood brought salvation for all of us, that we might be saints, that we might be saved, that we might wear the helmet of salvation. And now we're able to wear it around our heads to protect us, that in our confidence, we are able to remember that our salvation is not of this world. In fact, it allows us to continually have communion with God now and forever. I don't want to wear a helmet, literally, forever. But the salvation, the helmet of salvation will never be removed from my head when I reach eternity. It is amazing. It will be the realization. You know, David speaks over and over and over and over again in Psalms about it, but a couple of them that I just pulled out is the Lord is the light and my salvation. He is the light and he is my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? Psalm 37:39. The salvation of the righteous comes from who? Comes because they're doing everything right. Comes from the Lord. He is their stronghold in a time of trouble. And so we don't run afraid. We run this race, and we know that salvation comes not from man, but from God. It is not a president, a general, a war, another nation that saves or destroys. Our salvation is wholly and firmly authored by God for all. And our Lord just looks at a lot of things to save them. And it makes, it looks at the world to make things better for them. Isn't that interesting? This will be better. And to bring peace and to bring harmony into my life. It doesn't come from man. It doesn't come from the world. And I know even brothers and sisters who look to universities, if I can just get here, or to a vote, you must vote, you know, and shame others for, or a talent, or even a service that can save, but salvation doesn't come from us. And it doesn't come from the world. And that's not the way salvation of God works. Not even my service. As we've mentioned before, though I believe that because I wear the helmet of salvation, I will serve like nobody else. Like only I can serve, and everybody serves as they can serve. It is salvation that comforts the head, that cradles and protects our minds. And that is the salvation that gives us the peace, because it's our brains that it calms. It's the it's the ultimate. This is not a commentary on drugs, because I think that you ought to get help for whatever you need help for, and that God has given us modern medicine, but it is actually the great antidepressant. I tried to think of a name of a drug, but I can't remember names of drugs, but it is the great antidepressant. It is the great anxiety, to know that we are saved. It calms our thoughts. It provides us with the ability to see ourselves not as American, not as German, not as Indian, but as saved, as a saint. And we don't have to be anything else. And we just need to act like we have confidence in who we are, knowing who we are. You know, can you imagine if Paul wrote, well, you know, I've really done all of this, but I sure hope, I hope that when I get, he didn't say that. He had all confidence that he had poured himself out as a drink offering, and that there was something laid up for him. When Christ promises us that he's gone to prepare a place for us, do we say, I hope that's me? And having said that, we must strive to keep that helmet secure. It's not popping off and on just because we have lost our way for a minute. If we wear this salvation, we're not wearing it with our fingers crossed behind our back. Satan would love us to be insecure in the salvation that God has provided and promised. But that is not what God intends for his people. And I will tell you that if you feel like that, it is hard to teach the gospel message to someone because you do not have the confidence in it. When somebody asks you how you teach well, I'll tell you what you do. You believe in what you are talking about. And you have confidence in the God of promise. And that is the helmet of salvation, because we believe with all our hearts that he has allowed us to put it upon our heads. So what have we thought about this week? What have we thought is important this week? You want to know how you have, whether you can test whether or not you have that helmet of salvation upon your head? Have you had confidence? What have you thought about this week? What has consumed you this week? What has worried you this week? Have you remembered, wait a minute, I'm saved. I don't have to think about this. I don't have to worry about this. Have you remembered that you're a saint? And then if so, have you acted like you know that? And with confidence, you have believed it. Because if you have, nothing else matters, and we have acted like a saint. You know, Amy made some great points. We have acted like we love. We have acted like we have the message. We have acted like we know the light. We have acted like we are not in our self-righteous, but that we understand righteousness of God, not with our fingers crossed, but with great excitement of what is and what is to be. And that is what I would say.
And I think that those then are the things that show other people who we are. They manifest themselves in all of the other outward areas of our lives, and that's what brings other people to us.
Yeah.
How do I get that?
That's right.
How do I live with
then,
that confidence?
And your point in your question to me about the helmets that have the little stars on them, or if you look at the Roman soldiers and their feathers, those are natural outcomes of wearing the helmet of salvation throughout your life, that people can see what your salvation means to you. And they can see that in the decorations of that salvation, because it decorates your life. It absolutely brings you, it is not through us that the glory is seen, but through the salvation of God that he has presented to us, that it is seen. And it certainly is worn like little stars, and like, it certainly is. It's the fruit. It's the bearing of the fruit.
That's what I was going to say. It's the very fruit of it. And that understanding, I think for us, is also really important, that we can have confidence in it, that we don't have to wonder. I mean, we're told to approach confidently, to understand who we are and what's been offered to us. And so
it's not confidence in ourselves. I think that's where people get confused.
No,
it's confidence. It's not confidence in Liz. It's confidence in God.
Right.
And when we believe that God really does keep his promises to his people, that is the confidence that we have.
And if we understand all those things and we understand what God has given us, then why would we, to quote Randy, be an idiot and take it off?
It's true. Well, it's
true.
Actually, the same word is foolish. Why would we be foolish? If Solomon can use foolish, we certainly in our day can use idiot, can't we? It's the same thing.
I think so.
Those without
I think it's
brains.
okay.
Yeah.
I think it's okay. I tell my students, we were allowed to say shut up in our house. So I know it's not a bad word, even when they look at me and say, oh, Mrs. Carter, that's a terrible word. Like, it's not a bad word. We weren't allowed to say anything, and we could say that. So I think idiot will let fly. All right. Well, if you have made it through the entire discussion with us, we thank you for that. I'm always encouraged at the end of these to do better and to be better, and to make sure that my armor is fit and ready, assessing myself and my week, as Elizabeth was talking about. What did I do this week? What did I think about? What did I focus on? And so I think those are good thoughts, and I hope it's been encouraging to you too. Next month, our focus, oh, sorry, Jillian.
No, I was just say, remind them to
I have it all
in the
written.
changes. Okay. Just making sure.
I have to write it down because, coming up on 60, my brain's getting a little. But next month, our focus is the sword of the Spirit. And we hope that you'll log on to the website and read those articles. Amy's going to be the editor next month. We've got some good articles ready to go. We have more in the trenches articles coming out. And more translations are being loaded each week as they come in from our translators. So if you're more comfortable reading or listening in another language, you can look into those. I know that Elizabeth is adding to her study on the harmony of the Gospels, and we have some other classes in the works as well. We certainly appreciate the support that we've gotten so far, and above all, our prayer is that we glorify God and encourage each other, as we were talking about, as that it's important for us to be together and to remember who we are, and to remind each other that we have the helmets of salvation on our head. What in this world could we possibly fear? There's our armor is much stronger than our enemy, and our general is smarter and stronger and more glorious than certainly than our enemy or than ourselves or anything that we can imagine. If you are enjoying the content on the website, please feel free to share it with others. We're trying to push to get the word out a little better, to do a little more, I guess, advertising, for lack of a better word. But we sure appreciate you joining us, and we hope you have a great day.